No worries. Hello, everyone. We're back with another episode of True Psychiatry. I have today Michael Steger. I just learned how to say his last name. Um, I've been chasing Michael for a while. He was kind enough to agree with this chat in the pretty much last minute because I'm usually a very messy guy. I've been slightly worse lately. But Michael is a psychologist. He's a professor of psychology at Colorado State University. He's also the founder and director of the Center for Meaning and Purpose, and he has a series of publications in meaning. I found out about him once I got my current position as a director at a CCAP, and my bosses, pretty intelligent people. They're very flexible, and they give me a lot of leeway when it comes to practicing a psychiatry that makes sense. And one of the things I was trying to get rid of was of GAD-7 and PHQ-9, which was my last episode. I was bad mouthing those tools, not on account of them not having use, but I mentioned in the previous episode they make no sense because they pretty much suggest to the patient that the responsibility for any improvement will be on the pill and the pill only, while a scale for meaning in life really sends the right message saying, hey, have you addressed this matter? Just like quality of life measures, for example, have you addressed this matter? Because the message is you're not going to feel better until you do the things that make you feel better. So finally, I have Michael here. That was a year ago, and I actually asked him permission to use his scale, and he only request was as long as you're not profiting from it, you're wacko. And I said no, I'm not. And but I couldn't, unfortunately, because PHQ-9 and GAD-7 they're so ingrained in our system, and that I just there's federal requirements and things like that that suggest it would be a bad idea. So I ended up starting to play with the scale in my clinical practice and with the concept. And today I have him here for a master class on the matter. Michael, thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I think it's a really exciting sign of the times. Maybe not the times moving as fast as we'd like, but I think there's a lot more curiosity I'm seeing across traditional discipline focus areas. So I was invited to write a piece for World Psychiatry, the number one journal, and I guess anything starting with psych, according to those kind of metrics. And it was simply the editor wanted me to write about meaning in the context of psychological disorder and mental illness for a psychiatric audience. And I don't think that would have happened 10 years ago. So I think you're part of folks looking for holistic solutions, things that put some power, but also, speaking as someone who worked as a therapist for several years previously, a little bit of responsibility in the hands of clients as well.
Yeah,
So it's exciting to be here. Thank you.
I appreciate it. I had a few other guests who were also a bit surprised with this slope. You would expect to be faster, considering that we are seeing very poor results in the field of psychiatry. But as we were talking right before I started recording, we are a group of professionals that are pretty resistant to change, surprisingly. Can you tell us how this quest started? How the meaning quest, how the meaning quest became your meaning in life?
Yeah, I'll do my best without going too far back. I think it was just the kind of baked into the nature of the kid that I was. I we Early in my life we had moved to Buffalo, New York, where my dad was briefly on faculty at SUNY Buffalo. He's a psychiatrist. He's a psychologist. Worked his whole life after this brief stint in academia um, uh, as a practicing psychologist and directed a community mental health center. For what I remember about that time was we were in a pretty diverse group, university folks, and it just seemed like the world was big and weird and wild, and there were all types. And then we moved to rural Minnesota, so that my dad ended up running a clinic there, a community mental health clinic, sliding fee, sort of place, rural mental health. I mean, all of the exciting challenges. Me finding out that cops and judges knew who I was before I before I knew who they were, sort of thing. So it was a pretty small town. My impression was that somehow everyone had read the same pamphlet called Truths About the World that we never question. And I never got that. So I really just didn't understand. The more we learned about the world in school and the more I reflected on how different people were than what I, for briefly up until about the age of 7, have been used to, even in a place that maybe you don't think of as cosmopolitan, Buffalo, New York, but it was more cosmopolitan than Marshall, Minnesota, let's say. My impression was that somehow there was just this sense that the people there all had come to an agreement about how to live life, what counted as real experiences, who was right, and I just couldn't get it. I couldn't understand how they were so sure. I mean, I'm not sure they were, but like everyone seemed to be so on the same page. I just couldn't understand how people who, this was in the 1970s and 80s, like people weren't just flying around the world on cheap tickets, just to go take a picture at Trondheim or something like that. They were not traveling much. Well, the only place we ever traveled to was we took one road trip to California as a family. That was our big, exotic vacation. So these weren't people, including me, who are really out there experiencing the world, and yet people were so sure they had it all figured out, and I just couldn't get it, because also at the same time, among these people, there were really wonderful people and there were really terrible people. And they all seemed to have the same sort of belief that what they were doing was condoned by the powers that be. And that just really, it just like short circuited my head, I think. I was like, well, how, how did they come to feel like they're so certain? And why does that seem to empower them to feel okay about whatever they do? And so that was kind of like one half of the kernel. The other half of the kernel was like, why are people so terrible? Right? Why are we so terrible to each other? I mean, like everything from bullying to the Cold War. I mean, all that sort of stuff that was going on. Just understand why after, after however many thousands of years you believe human culture's been around, I mean, at least 6,000, right? We're still not better at living. And so those thoughts kind of stuck in my head. Like, on the one hand, people can become so sure of how the world works based on truly inadequate, minimal information. And on the other hand, even given everything that we've collected as a species over thousands of years, we still don't know how to do it right. Like, so I think that over time just turned into this idea that, well, what if we really engage with that question? What if we really engage with the idea that we have this life, the rules are hard to pick out, and if you just believe the first thing you hear, it ends up being arbitrary. There's millions of different ways to do things in the world. And yet is maybe the most important thing that we will face, trying to determine for ourselves, like, how do we live? How do we be human in this world in a way that's not terrible for ourselves or for other people of the planet? So that was kind of just, I might sound like an especially weird kid. I think I was only regular weird, but, like that kind of grew over time into a couple of different interest areas. So I grew up Catholic, and I thought I had to be a priest. And then suddenly I remember realizing one day that my dad wasn't a priest, so there must be a loophole out of that sort of thing. And so that's why I wanted to be a psychologist then. I was like, well, I guess I could, if I do therapy, then I don't have to be a priest. So that was kind of what led me down the road of psychology. And I just ended up falling in love with the existential approaches, Irv Yalom, Viktor Frankl, and found some of those early clinical experiences, particularly with folks struggling with trauma, particularly intimate violence, family sexual abuse, like some of those issues of meaning and how do we pull, what is the story that starts lurking in the back of my mind? Like Aaron Beck would call it like core beliefs or something like that, right? Like, how do we formulate this like unspoken knowledge about the rules of the world based on some of these most horrific experiences, and how do we kind of unpack that? And I carried that into my quest for a PhD, and accidentally, 100% accidentally, fell in love with research at that point, because I really just wanted to do supervision and assessment. That's why I was going for my PhD at that point. And I just was like, wait, I can actually try to answer these questions that have been bugging me since I was whatever age. Yeah. Long story. kept long for your for your listeners, I guess.
We have time. We have time. Very good. Thank you. So then you started to explore this idea of meaning. I was reading some of your materials, obviously, and you have a statement here. You say, meaning life has been defined as people's subjective judgments, that their lives are marked by coherence, purpose, and significance. Can you explain if there's a difference between purpose, significance, and what do you mean by coherence here?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we can certainly do this. We've got empirical data that support that they can be separated, although they're highly closely related. But conceptually, the way I like to break it down is, well, starting with the first two, and you might, working in a clinical practice, find that the third one, the most recent one, is the most obvious one. But of course, uh, to some degree, it seems so obvious we forgot to think about it. So the first one is, does your life make sense? Right? It's like about the huge master schemas in our heads, the master meaning systems, the rules that we follow implicitly or explicitly. Something like do good things happen to bad people, or do good things happen only to good people? All those sorts of ideas about how the world is supposed to work, right? No one gets away with crime. If I'm good, my life will turn out well. I can or I can't ever trust someone in an intimate relationship, like all those sorts of things. Ideas about like learned helplessness would be baked in there. Ideas about empowerment and owning and appreciating and having pride in your identity, even if it's marginalized by society around you. Like all this sort of stuff that you can say, here's the rules, here's how I make sense of life. Very cognitive. Oftentimes people can declare these ideas to you, and they'll just say like for example, in a psychiatric practice, you might have people who are very resistant to medication and choose to believe people on TikTok or YouTube over evidence because of some corruption in the system. On the other hand, you might have people who say like they gave it a try. They tried Headspace for 2 weeks and it didn't work, so now it's time for medication because this is clearly a medical issue, right? And so those ideas could get baked into something like that as well. What usually ends up happening in this coherence space, other people call it comprehension. What usually happens in this space is that we start to see that we have been learning rules all our lives, right? And this is really the sort of meanings then that can shape what we think is possible in our lives, what we think of as ourselves, what we believe about relationships, how we find a place for ourselves in the world. Like it's really the understanding what's going on. And I guess the opposite of that would be chaos, right? If everything's constantly chaos, I don't understand how my mind works. I don't understand why I can't control my behavior. I don't understand why people don't want to be friends with me. Like when everything is like, I don't understand this. Like you just think about March, April, May of 2020, when the world completely changed on pivoted on a dime during COVID. I think trying to figure out what does this all mean, like that's that use of meaning, and it applies to our own lives as well. Purpose is sort of the oldest one because at least in the United States, it seemed to promise an economic return on effort, which is the only thing that we care about in this country, right? So where Viktor Frankl would say that during his experiences during the Holocaust, he would see that everyone was like everyone was abused, everyone was beaten, everyone was starved, everyone was frozen, everyone was tortured, everyone had been stripped of their dignity, right? Like in the concentration camps and in the Holocaust, and even in the dehumanizing behavior towards people in the Third Reich before that. This was a common source of suffering that everyone experienced, but the people who made it through those experiences alive had something to live for, right? They still felt like their lives were going to carry forward to be able to do something. And so that's the first place where we really start to talk about purpose as a psychological idea, that in the future, there's a use for me. There's something I'm going to do with my life. So then purpose emerges as this robust, overarching motivational and sort of drive piece. So purpose helps us figure out I always use the analogy of the Sydney Harbor Bridge, right? It's this like just a classic arch bridge, and purpose is like the arch, right? It connects us from the past to the future and in the present. And it supports a lot of different things that we can run through. So a well-functioning purpose organizes our goals for us. It organizes our priorities, but it also lives as an expression of our priorities and things like that. So purpose is really the motivational and action-directed component, and it's very, very future-oriented. So it kind of makes that future come alive for us. Now, the last one that we've started researching only in the last few years, some folks research it as mattering, and other folks research it as significance, and where no one's quite sure if there's the same or different because it's so early days in the research. When I came at this, I was thinking of significance and kind of answering Albert Camus' big puzzle for philosophy, which is, why don't we all off ourselves, right? Philosophy has to come up with an answer for why we don't just all kill ourselves when things get rough. And there was a little bit of a research program in the 80s called Reasons for Living, right? It was sort of like a flip side of suicidal ideation and suicidal intention research. And if people could fill out this Reasons for Living scale, then they'd stick around. And so significance in some sense is this idea that life is worth living. My own life and my own experience has inherent value. And then when you add mattering to it, then it matters that I exist. Like the universe or people around me or something notices that I'm here, and I kind of have some sort of important role to play. So significance I call an evaluative dimension of meaning. And it's really all about, like, do we have a reason to be here? Is all this crap worth it? Yeah. So hopefully you can see that they're going to meet in a lot of places, but that you can, at least with clients, for example, if you open different kinds of conversations that I think are a lot easier than, what does your life mean? You can use anything from cognitive therapy to unpack coherence. You can use anything from motivational interviewing to stages of change theory to unpack purpose. And you can really get it at almost any kind of relational, existential, or humanistic approach to try and unpack the significance area. So like really different kinds of conversations, almost, I would feel pretty confident, almost for sure, most clients will have at least one that makes sense to them in their own way of living their lives.
Yeah, I can see with the coherence concept, there's one thing that we do in clinical work. I think, if I remember correctly, was Judith Herman when talking about trauma. She mentioned that, did she or I understood? When you don't know if you read it or you understood it from the text. But one thing that comes up in clinical work with patients that have meaningful histories of trauma is that their sense of order in the world is sort of snapped. And because, like the coherence, right? It's like, if I'm a good person, how come this thing happened to me? Or the impact it has in people that actually perpetrated violence on account of being in the military or something, and things that you would usually think are unlikely to happen. People traumatized will think, no, that's pretty reasonable that it would happen, right? So I remember this event when I was training still, and during some work at the VA, they had that a journalist that I think was a journalist that was beheaded on a video, and the word around the hospital was that a lot of the vets were barricading themselves in their houses, thinking that terrorists would just go about knocking doors and doing that to vets. And of course, some areas of the country are more, being in the military is more popular than others. And of course, like for me, I would say that's unlikely, awfully unlikely that something like that would happen. But for someone who was actually at war and maybe kicking doors down and checking houses and, scaring people to a corner and things like that, or facing some shootings, for them, that sense of order in the world was kind of lost. Even the statistical order, right? Like it's probabilistic. It's probably not going to happen. But, once you have been there, so that's very interesting concept. Now, can you tell us about the research on meaning and well-being? Because
I mean,
it sounds amazingly robust.
yeah, it's sort of incredible. So I'll give a little. I want to also say that my first among my first research entrees into the meaning space was post-traumatic growth, stress-related growth, that side of things. And one of the influential ideas stuck in the back of my head was Ronnie Janoff Bullman's 1979, I think, or maybe 83 book called Shattered Assumptions,
Oh,
or
I don't know
Shattered
that one.
Assumptions Theory. This is the idea exactly as you say, like we live our lives and our brains are geared, and in my opinion, many other people's opinions, our brains are kind of geared to figure out with the least number of rules how to make life feel consistent and predictable. And then some statistically unlikely thing or aberrant occurrence happens to us, and it just shatters this like view we had of the world, or this like it's like it throws the board game in the air, and like we're left with nothing and have to rebuild. So this idea of shattered assumptions for sure predates when I started thinking about this sort of stuff. So when I started my early work, I was just trying to capture what people had already been writing across a bunch of different disciplines to come up with this consensus definition. And my early interest then was interested pretty much in clinical stuff, but when I said I wanted to study meaning in life, I was told by really smart people that that's not a you can't do that, right? You can't study this sort of thing. It's non-scientific. So I would get three responses, right? One, you can't study it. It's non-scientific. Two, I didn't know you were so religious. And three, it's so obvious. Why bother studying it? I was like, well, listen, I'm going to do it anyways. And so my turn towards well-being really started because I was looking at other people who managed to find a good way to study kind of fuzzy ideas. And I found Ed Diener, who studied life satisfaction and subjective well-being. He wanted to study happiness. He was told by publishers and other academics, you can't study this. So he just changed the name to subjective well-being and became one of the most highly published social psychologists of all time on this topic. So I started really more or less following his playbook. I was like, okay, you need a good measure. Okay, we'll start on that. You need to have a diverse array of research methods, and you have to publish with the best rigor you can muster. And so that really led me to kind of keep writing about well-being. And instead of, I guess those two paths diverged in a woods, and I was kind of keeping my feet in the clinical side, studying depression and post-traumatic growth and PTSD and social anxiety and things like that. But then the traction, the speed with which you can, at least with which I could, without access to a clinical population, publish data on well-being was faster. So at that time when I defended my dissertation in 2006, I knew the entire literature. It was about 300 to 400 articles, most of which was clinically based. So it was things like alienation, substance use, suicidal ideation, alcohol, community-based alcohol abstinence support programs, homeless street youth. I mean, this is like schizophrenia. There's an amazing article on schizophrenia, right? Like, so that was really where the roots were. But then by the time I was doing my dissertation, I had access to convenience samples and I needed to publish a lot. So I was really just looking at well-being. So fast forward from 2006 to today, my estimate for what will happen in 2024 is that probably something like 6,000 or 7,000 papers will be published on meaning in life just this year. So the research is massive. Nobody knows it anymore. Like just in the last 10 years, nobody knows this research anymore because it's so massive. But when you decide you want to ask specific questions, you find what you're looking for. That's part of the thing that's so amazing about what's happened just in the past 15 years is that you might have a question like, is there anything out there on clinical outcomes and meaning in life? And there are, right? So in some cases, if people have a sense of meaning or purpose, depending on whose scale you're using, prior to or early stages of treatment, their outcomes are better than if they have low levels of meaning. There's some indication even that folks who are searching for meaning, if you can work with them to frame that in a kind of existentially accepting way rather than a, I guess, capitalistically foreclosing way, right? Where like, why would I look for what I already have? If you don't have meaning, it means you suck at life. Like if we can avoid that kind of framework and get to the idea that humans are always going to try to figure stuff out as we go, that we change over time, things happen to us that we wish wouldn't, some things that we wish would happen don't, like that we're kind of beings in flux, all trying to make sense of what's going on. Like there's even some research suggesting that that is predictive of better outcomes. What might surprise your listeners the most is that there's now been a meta-analysis of just my scales results with regard to measures of psychological distress. Usually not categorical ones, right? But like usually continuous, measured continuously with sub-threshold or more personality-based measures of depression, anxiety, hostility, stress, all those sorts of things. But sometimes like the real diagnostic indicators that have cut scores and all that sort of stuff. So there's been a meta-analysis on that. There's been, I think, at least one, maybe two now, meta-analyses on mortality and meaning in life. That there's a consistent and significant benefit to mortality, or at least a positive relationship between mortality and sense of meaning in life. With longitudinal studies, dozens of studies now looking at that same thing. So we're at this wild place. I know I'm not really talking about well-being because you guys took your poison there. Like whatever well-being variable you want, I'll be able to find your research on it.
Well, but that's very, and I'm going to sound terribly lazy right now for a nerd, but if you could send me the reference, or even if you could talk about what you found on schizophrenia and meaning, as you mentioned, there was a beautiful article. And if you could send me the reference on this meta-analysis, because you see, there's a slow awakening happening in the field of psychiatry. We have, maybe 20 years ago, I think, this movement in the UK started called critical psychiatry, where basically they started by Joanna Moncrief and a few more names. They started to look at this idea that we have brain diseases that were never proven, never found after billions invested in research for depression. We haven't found anything so far. But our practices, even if you talk to a psychiatrist, because I've been doing this for a short while, and I've been in a lot of these conversations, and they're rarely pleasant. But as you talk to a psychiatrist on the idea of, or a psych nurse practitioner, as we have in America, on the idea of a brain disease, they start the discussion convinced there is a brain disease that like ignoring 100 years of production in psychology that suggests that the brain is this very fine-tuned machine responding to reality. But all of a sudden we have 88 million Americans on psych meds, suggesting 88 million Americans have brain diseases, which is just mathematically impossible if you compare to any other organ in the body. And yet all those people still operate very well in their environment, suggesting that, what is this brain disease that affects particularly your mood, while you still can perform all other tasks fairly well, enough to keep yourself alive. Like nobody's dying out of cold because they made a poor prediction on temperature, or, so all the organs, you still continue to respond to the environment with fair precision, but your emotions are disconnected somehow. And, but when you start this conversation, usually my colleagues will start from a position where, there's a brain disease. But as you progress, invariably, I win the discussion because the data is on my side, and ends with saying, no, we don't really believe there's a brain disease, right? But the whole practice is built on as if, because all that is done, and, like people can keep their protestations for themselves. All that is done in the psychiatric field right now, with maybe 1% exception of the providers, is we do med tweaks. We add meds, we increase a dose, we replace a dose. If you go and do a polypharmacy report on any clinic out there, you may not be able to sleep at night with what you're going to see, right? And So all this information, there's this seed of change coming up where this kind of information, this kind of data starts getting more relevance, because whatever we have been doing over the past 4 years is not cutting. And there's a good chance we're hurting more than helping. So we have this new publication now by Mark Horowitz. It's a Maudsley Prescribing Guidelines. Is this very solid and reliable book in the field of psychiatry that tells you how to, play with drugs. Now they published a deprescribing guidelines, saying, we went too far. It is a statement of the times. We went too far, and the answer, it's a tool. Drugs, please, right? I love alcohol and nicotine for weekends, but I use them as needed, or PRN, as we say in my field.
That's right.
So nothing against the drugs, but there's something wrong with the idea that everyone feeling sad or every human trait needs to be medicated, as opposed to say, hey, let's look to our context. Let's look to emotional needs, Let's look to the fact that living without a sense of meaning is a very difficult thing to do, or without some sense of order in the world, that's going to make our life much harder. And per se, life is and should be a bit difficult, So it's pretty cool. What you're saying about this kind of research is actually very helpful for the people that took the red pill and woke up. Because the question there is, every time I present these matters, is, and that's Stephen Hayes' opinion. When I interviewed, he said, Rod, I never saw a clinician that didn't want what's best for their patients. So his take was, we just don't know how to do better. Right. And again, I have my doubts, but in general, I'm a deep believer in human beings. I think, we're fantastic. And based on that, the fact that you're saying, no, there's a lot of data on well-being and meaning, and that gives us a path to follow. So I really appreciate that kind of information.
Yeah. I mean, there's just to sort of fill out the landscape of this research a little bit more. There's some low-hanging fruit that you might think goes with meaning in life, right? So people tend to have more commitment or comfort level with their religious and spiritual lives. Right? That's one part that people might tend to look towards. And as folks in clinical work would probably agree, when someone has a sense of meaning, or at least when they make a meaning about a traumatic event in their past, or maybe they make a meaning that's productive regarding their psychological disorder that they're working around. Like, folks who have that sense of meaning do get through difficult times better. They get through adversity better. And you can also show that it's not just because they held their breath and the wave passed over them and they weren't really affected. You can see research indicating they're using more effective coping strategies as well. They're using cognitive restructuring, they're using problem-focused coping, they're using social support more effectively. There's another fascinating area of research now showing that people who have a sense of meaning and purpose are more effective in their utilization of the healthcare system. Like, they tend to go much more for prophylactic care and much less for emergency room care. Like, so
that's a selling point.
There you go. Yeah. And they tend to have slightly higher levels of adherence to what their doctors say. So, I mean, so you see that there's some of these hints then that, so not only do people with a sense of meaning and purpose kind of feel better, right? Like positive emotions, higher life satisfaction, higher just generalized happiness, like some of that sort of stuff, but they're kind of living slightly differently, and they're living what our current state of psychology says would be more effectively. So if we flip it to an example you gave around substances, we see in general lower levels of substance use among folks who have a stronger sense of meaning and purpose. We also see, though, like more healthy attitudes towards things like condom use during sexual encounters for STI prevention. We see more nutritional food choices. We see better, more higher levels of physical activity and more adherence to exercise. So we just sort of see like, I started calling it a proactive health orientation at one point. Like, you have a life, you think it's meaningful, you're happy you're here, we're all worthwhile, so you tend to invest a little bit better in it. And then just my last little like compartment I want to fill in, because it really desperately needs this side of the conversation, at least in American well-being science, because we tend to focus so much on the individual, right? So well-being, all this sort of stuff makes the person feel better, and if the person feels better, we're winning, right? But people with a stronger sense of meaning and purpose also tend to be more generous. They tend to be more kind. They have more altruistic motivations. They have more satisfying relationships. There's even some experimental studies showing that when college students are brought together for a study and they just interact with people randomly, and then they're asked, who would you like to interact with again if we forced you to interact with one of these strangers again, they'll pick people who have higher scores on meaning in life, even though they don't have that data. So it comes through in the way that people are interacting somehow. So you can kind of make the argument that ideally, not in every case, this is all aggregated data, smeared across the whole distribution, but ideally, when we invest in trying to make our life, when we invest the effort, and sometimes it's scary effort, and sometimes it's hard effort, in building a life that's meaningful, when we learn the skills for doing that, when we practice them, try to execute a purpose in our lives, like not only are we better for ourselves, but we're better for other people. And there's even some research showing we're better for the planet as well. So it's just kind of like it's capturing a lot, or at least it's attached to a lot of what we think of when we think of being a good person trying to live a good life for a better world. So it's a little bit like, it's a little full featured, all of this sort of stuff. So it's been fascinating to see that research explode.
That's very cool. That is very cool. So now we have values-based living being a topic frequenting psychotherapy. We have Seligman's positive psychology that covers a bunch of interesting things. That is not that different from Maslow. That is not that different from Frankl. That is not that different from Jung. But I really like the way Seligman put it, and I think there's a lot of backing from evolutionary psychology, but also when you look to Seligman's PERMA, right, the positive emotions, engagement in life, relationships, meaning, accomplishments. I developed some teaching materials that are designed to be very pragmatic, because I'm always trying to teach psychiatrists and psych NPs, and maybe by selection bias as a profession, we're not very conceptual. So things have to be more like, okay, how do I read this thing and start practicing tomorrow, right? It gotta be in that format. And I always treated those things in terms of emotional needs, right? Having a sense of purpose, having, or maybe what Seligman would call engagement in life, right? You got to be chasing your tail about some stuff, and relationships, and a lot of them I could, and of course this is me running ideas by you, so I don't waste your time and your brain, neither the opportunity. But I always see those things as emotional needs, and it seems to be in clinical work that. It seems to me that if you don't have a basic satisfaction of emotional needs, your chances at working at higher level stuff, like let's say psychodynamic approaches or anything like that, or even working in a relationship, if a lot of your needs that could be attended by a meaningful relationship are not attended. Are very slim. So usually I have this focus on quality of life. Like I'm not really in the business of changing anybody's mind. I'm in the business of trying to help them change their lives, because, I still see emotions as an epiphenomena for the most part. So if you're feeling sad, something's making you feel sad, that kind of idea. And and seeing the meaning, like the amount of people that present down in the office, and by exploring the concept of meaning, and all associated metaphors, because it's a conceptual thing. And I always saw having a meaning as an emotional need, but I cannot pin that down to evolutionary psychology, for example. Even though, and I usually use an argumentation that covers both biblical references and evolution. I don't have knowledge of other religions enough to do that. So I sort of trying to cover all the argumentation to all the angles. But for me, it seems that the need for meaning comes from the fact that we can talk. And the fact that we can talk means we have a word for death. We have a comprehension. Like my dog doesn't have a word for no food and owner gone, right? But I have a word for all of those things. And by the moment I can actually signify things in its absence, right? I don't need to see my wife packing and leaving to suffer her absence. I can just imagine that and say, oh, fuck, I don't want that to happen. So I always thought that there's a need for a sense of meaning that stems from, with atheists maybe would use that to say, well, that's why religions were invented, a need for a meaning. And I wonder if that comes from the fact that we know we're going to be gone at some point. And that really raises the question, what the hell? Right? Would that make sense for you? Do you think that's a proper way to define this problem? Because I cannot understand, I cannot see, I guess what I'm trying to say is I cannot see that the need for a sense of meaning, it's just a plus. I don't think that's just a cherry on top of a sundae. I think that's the sundae, brother. It's a need. It's very unlikely that you can live a barely decent life without that.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder about this myself because I can't really think of a great way to test everything out. I mean, the closest that we get to is, can we do things that increase meaning and then do other good things happen? And yes. Can we increase other good things and then meaning happens? Well, yes. Right. So like, there's not like, we can't experimentally get ourselves to a first cause of human psychological functioning and kind of put meaning in order of what comes first. The paradigms that we use a lot of times when we think through evolutionarily rooted human features is thinking through survival functions, right? And it feels to a lot of us like the most important survival experiences occurred in the ancient ancestral environments, right? Where we were kind of pre-cultural. And in that case, you see a lot of strong indicators for the ability to bond socially. You see a lot of strong indicators to be able to be afraid of something, to be able to be joyful about something, right? Like that's kind of where people have said, like, yeah, so it'd be an advantage if you weren't appropriately afraid, you'd go pet the lion and then you're dead, right? Or if you weren't able to experience joy, then you don't open yourselves up to creating, like Bob Fredrickson's broaden and build model of positive emotions, right? You don't broaden your cognitive horizons. You don't also build psychological and social resources, right? So like that's one of the framings. Meaning is trickier, right? Because it probably is a bit of a cultural advantage, right? You could argue that language was maybe not immediately a survival advantage in the same way that fear was, right? Like being able to talk about what color this leaf is on this tree versus that leaf on that tree eventually could help out, right? If you need to describe to someone without actually being able to show them which leaf to gather for food. But you could argue in a sense that things like language, mathematics, those do have a survival advantage, but probably in a post-cultural era, right? When really our survival is being debated with groups and where knowledge doesn't have to be held just in the head of one person in one lifetime, right? So I think once we spring from that moment of where I don't have to remember every single thing about what it takes to survive, or I don't have to be a part of a group who remembers every single thing, between us how to survive, but I can have some way of receiving knowledge of other people's experiences and have that encapsulated in stories or myths or tales or even manuals on how to do stuff. Like at that point, it feels to me as a dabbler at best in all this evolutionary psychology stuff that the bases for survival become dramatically different. And we do start to talk about things that don't properly exist, right? We talk about concepts at that point. And once we're in this conceptual space, I think this weird accident occurs. And probably before this as well, right? So sometimes I'll talk about how I think meaning is probably an emergent property, at least the coherent side of things, because our brains needed to be able to process because of our super complex social structures. We need to be able to process things like a slight coldness of someone suddenly cooling our relationship down. We need to process that. A weird look, a glance between two people, a slight nervous stance of someone as our group is negotiating with another group. We need to be able to quickly process like massively complex data. And so that probably built a brain that was ready to leap beyond the individual experience like that. That's how I think of it. And so once that occurs, meaning could be seen in one sense as being a high level indicator of well functioning cognitive complexity, right? Because now we can not only tackle ideas around, is this person going to stab me? Am I going to be left by alone without the ability to procreate or whatever, like maybe what we sometimes think of as more rudimentary concerns, although I would argue they're pretty important. We can move on to things like how will we debate and select the identity basis for our group, right? How are we going to decide what rules must be followed, which ones are negotiable, and how important is it to us to have other people believe these same rules, or are we fine with them having their own rules, right? Like once we get to those things about like, yeah, this is really what we want to say about how all of this sort of works. We set the stage for people to be able to use meaning in really powerful ways, I think. And usually, what I think one of the things that jumps out to me is the idea of purpose might be really important then, right? Because you're thinking about what's going to happen many, many years down the road. How are we going to preserve knowledge, right? Like a slightly modern example, the great library at Alexandria, right? Like Ptolemy decided at one point, we get copies of you have to bring manuscripts with you when you want to trade with the riches of Egypt and the Nile, and we're going to copy all your manuscripts, and you'll be punished if you try to hide any from us. And so they're just like, that's an important thing for that culture, right? And other cultures, I mean, some later Arabic cultures in particular were collecting manuscripts and things like that. But that idea that amassing knowledge was important, like that's an advantage that only can kind of take place when someone says, okay, well, this will be important over the next 100,000 years, whatever it might be. You see this also in indigenous agricultural practices, right? Where sort of like lightly but distinctly interacting with entire ecosystems so that they're abundant with food products and yet self-sustaining. Like that's a multi-generational project. So it's going to unfold over spans of time that without something to capture that, I would argue maybe purpose is the thing that captured that ability to say, okay, it's not important now, but trust me, it's going to be really important later. And you also can see, I would say, like within the evolutionary standpoint, again, probably at a more collective level, I'm really fixated. I apologize on this similar ancient period of like, you just look at how the Neo-Babylonians, right, Nebuchadnezzar of biblical fame, how Nebuchadnezzar is treated compared to Cyrus the Great, right, the Persians. So the Neo-Babylonians came in and pretty much destroyed everything. Like that, they were using this old method where you come in, you're the scariest, you're the baddest King Kong of all, and people just have to submit to your will. And then the Persians came along, just as bad, just as forceful, but like we're really like, yeah, do your thing, just be part of our group. If you don't, it'll be not go so well for you. We will parade your sons around before we slaughter them or something, right? But like, generally speaking, let's just be part of this incredible culture. And like, when you have the ancient Greeks and Alexander the Great, like, oh my God, I wish I was Persian. You think they put together something pretty amazing. And that feels like a really big coherence advantage for an entire civilization, right? Like just to organize itself around some basic principles and still feel connected across distances, languages, religions, histories, explanations of where the world came from and who's really a god and who's not. So I feel like meaning really starts to take off as a powerful force once it becomes collectivized, and once we have things like transmission of knowledge and ideas across time and through that imaginary world that you talked about around language. Like once you have a word for death, like what are you going to do with that? And if your culture knows what to do with that, as opposed to not know what to do with it, like I think that your whole culture has a chance to survive. And then a lot of us folks with like, not great fighting skills have a shot. Or I'm 6'6", so I'd be like a great arrow catcher, right? Back in those days. So I'm glad they came up with meaning to sort of let cultures survive at that point. So that's one thought. Otherwise, it's like, and then in that case, then meaning functions. I think meaning really then for us as an indicator is really fascinating because you can work directly on it, but it also might be something that is indicative. If my proposition that meaning became evolutionarily most significant at the collective level, then our individual experience of meaning should be reflecting our relationship to some collective, right? Like you can see even Emil Durkheim, 1898, in his book on suicide, he was a sociologist. He's writing how when people would lose their jobs, they would feel a loss of purpose to society and become suicidal, right? So like you could almost argue then that meaning could be part of this way of gauging whether we have a place in something bigger than ourselves. You hear people talk a lot about that. Seligman talks about, using your strengths in the service of something bigger than yourself. But if meaning really exploded as an important factor at a collective cultural level, then our feelings of meaning and purpose might be reflective of our relationship to something big and collective. And when it was a little village of 300 people and my last name meant the job that my family did for generations, that was probably easier than when suddenly any of us can look up online 1,600 different religions with 1,600 different gods and 1,600 different rules, and one country thinks they're the best way on earth and another country thinks they're the best way on earth, and suddenly the world is full of like collective we don't know how to relate. And if we feel alienated from the people close to us, it probably drains us of that sense of meaning for that collective reason.
That's very interesting what you said about meaning in the society and the relationships. And continuing on the same line of thought, and asking you, I know you're mostly a researcher now and you haven't had clinical experience in a while. However, I can imagine you could work as a sort of a consultant, and thinking that my peeps, right, the prescribers, we are very pragmatic when it comes to the knowledge that we attend to, unfortunately. How can we tap in clinical work on meaning to help patients go through life? How would you advise myself and my listeners to say, hey, this is what you can do? You can ask the questions, like you can use how can we bring that? How can we, because a lot of people are feeling lost, and no wonder, right? I would say to you that the absolute majority of my patients are living a life without a sense of meaning, and with a few exceptions. And the exceptions at times are when I ask, for example, an adult woman, about a sense of meaning, life, what matters for you here. I hear things like, for example, my life are my kids, which is a good thing, but they're more than just a mother. They have more roles than just a mother, and kids eventually leave the house, hopefully, and we're really raising them for the adventure they have, for their own quest, as opposed to maintain that feeling, that I have a purpose or something like that. So, but in general, I'm going to say that, what brings people, if I could be so bold to say, is the fact that they're lost. in terms of meaning. So, for the folks listening now, what could you say? How can we tap into that? How can we start poking those ideas in our patients' heads and get them more contemplative? Because one concern I have, and just forgive me for extending myself, and I bring that off in my podcast, and it's that if my medications were to work, which they're very modest, the response to modern psychiatry has very modest, to say the best, response on. But if they were to work, I would be suppressing a discomfort that, until proven otherwise, has a function, right? And so I'm going to inherit a case who's taking 3-4 meds, and they're living this purposeless life where the goal is to suppress the discomfort, so they, sit in their couches, watch Netflix, and nothing else is there. And at times I find myself finding patients to be so emotionally numb that I actually have to clear up, like very slowly taper meds until they start experiencing things again. And then once they start experiencing things, now we can actually have a real conversation about what life is about, because even what's the purpose of psychiatry is a question that was not answered yet. But sorry, I spoke too much. How can we tap into it? How can we start poking our patients to actually reflect on this thing and find it and experience all the benefits that come from living a meaningful life?
Yeah, I mean it's going to be tricky. So we do have more knowledge now on what moves the needle, but it's not so much different than this little story I'm going to tell, which was, for most of my career, when people would ask me, is there anything that people can do that research shows increases meaning in life? I'd say, yes, but you're not going to like the answer. The answer was psychotherapy, right? And not an encouraging YouTube video, or not a daily affirmation, but psychotherapy, right? So what that really breaks down to most of the time, and I think you and other professionals in psychiatry will recognize something here pretty profound, which is kind of effort over time, directed flexibly, right? As things change, and it's not really possible to have a better life unless you change how you're living. And that takes hard work. So if you want a more meaningful life, you probably have to do more meaningful things. Now, if you already know what those things are, then getting some encouragement, or getting out of a hole, or getting rid of, or at least tampering down some symptoms that are really interfering, whether that's physical pain or emotional pain, or other things, distortion of reality, things like that are interfering. If you know already what's going to make your life meaningful, and you're feeling inhibited by symptoms that are keeping you suppressed, that removing those symptoms certainly seems like a legitimate way to help people dive into the things that they feel like will make their lives meaningful. The trick comes if people are not so sure, or in the example you gave, my purpose is my children. What does that look like when they're 2 versus 12 versus 22 versus 42? So you don't get to hold life to be the exact way you want it to be. We can't really, it's really, really hard for us to optimize towards life as a static object. And so then, of course, things are going to change as well. But the downside of effort over time towards things that are important is sometimes people don't know. So I'll have some thoughts about that as well. Maybe sometimes psychiatrists don't know, or college professors don't know. We're doing the best we can. Like I'm giving a talk in London just in a few days, and it's about the purpose crisis. But the image I'm using is just a race where we just try to go as fast as we can. We don't even know why. We just know whatever it is, we have to do more of it, and we have to do it faster. And like that's kind of part of the purpose crisis. Like we feel like we're in a system and we can't not do something, and we're falling behind all the time, so we have to do something even faster. So as a professional in education, as a professional in research, as a professional in speaking and consulting and things like that, I always feel like I'm supposed to just be doing more of something, or else I'm falling behind. Someone will get my business, or my students won't learn enough, or I won't be influential in the research space I care about, or my bosses won't think I'm doing a good enough job within a industry that's structured by powerful outside forces. Which, I mean, as a speaker and a consultant, I'm subject to powerful outside forces, but like my research and my teaching, I kind of get to decide how much and what style that I want to do. But I'm not billing insurance. I'm not working within schedules of medications. I'm not structured in that way. So there are interfering factors to being able to think that you have the time yourself to explore these kinds of questions sometimes. Like, what is the purpose of psychiatry? You said is an unanswered question so far. And all questions about what is the purpose of something are kind of unanswered. They're all, or partially answered for now, I would say, right? So trying to find some time to make this feel like a legitimate, if you think it's legitimate for your clients, it should be legitimate for yourself as well. The other downside for that is that you need to probably have time with clients where you can spend a little bit of effort. And if you've got 10 minutes or 20-minute sessions, you probably have to have impactful but executable goals in mind if you want to open up something as big and as messy as meaning. And so I would say, I'll start you off with know your client, right? And we'll just pretend there's two types of people in the world with regard to meaning. For one, well, first of all, there's at least four, but like some people care about it, some people don't, right? Some people it's an irrelevancy to them, and that's fine. So within the people who care about it, if you can detect like no interest, no passion around what's the meaning of your life, how are you feeling, does your life feel meaningful, do you have a purpose that's satisfying for you to pursue, things like that. But if you get some traction there, then there's still two more types of people, and one type of person really seems to want as much certainty as possible. And that certainty should be located as close as possible to things that they already know or already know how to do or are already doing, right? So like that's like I just want to know I'm on the right track, right? If you can think of someone as like I want to know I'm on the right track, why question things if it's going pretty well? There's one playbook for them, and it's really a lot about consolidating, deepening, sharing, right? So if religion is an amazingly profound example of this, right? Probably many people who come to see you don't want to go shopping for a new religion among all the world's religions, past and current, right? Like people who are attached to religion get a lot of strength out of that in times of hardship, get a lot of inspiration out of it in times of goodness. It helps them find their community. It helps them connect with families and traditions through the ages. It's a powerful, powerful thing. So the role of someone who really just wants that to be the right track is, have you looked into maybe deepening? Maybe you could join a discussion group, or you could volunteer a little bit more. Sharing. Are you talking not like a missionary necessarily, but are you talking about the role that religion plays in your life with your family members? Like, do your kids have any idea why you're going to temple or synagogue or mass? Right. So like there's those sorts of things where you really want to be helping people just have little bits, and stepping into religion is maybe not the first place to do it, but like things like asking people, like, what really feels like the most valuable parts of your life? Or if you could just retire today, or you won the lottery, what would you want to spend a little bit more time on? Maybe not all day, every day, but what would be among the first few things you'd really like to just do a little bit more of? And can you tell me why that is, right? Like, what does that do for you? What were some previous experiences where you got to spend a little bit more time And what was that like, right? Like sort of helping them unpack and just feel like, oh yeah, this is this awesome thing that I already have. It just needs more nurturing, or I just need more nurturing from it, right? So that's type 1 person. And depending on the type of person you are, I'm the other type of person. So I have to remind myself that I'm dealing with the type 1 person who really, really just wants to keep nurturing that one garden, right? And make it look, they already know what they want it to look like. And I'm helping them make it look like that. The type 2, more me, more neurotic, to be frank, is the person who suspects this is none of this is answerable in any permanent way, that it's a process over time, that asking the question, what makes life meaningful, is more powerful than having an answer to the question, what makes life more meaningful. So we call these high searchers, like people are searching for meaning. That's one of the scales of the MLQ. And you need a little conversation with people to find out if someone who's searching is like, I'm searching because I know I've got it and I just love being on this path. It's like someone who's hiking a path that they love and like, I can't wait to see that waterfall that's coming up. And then there's that beautiful meadow. Like they want more of the same thing. And then there's people who are like, I don't know what's out there, right? Like it could be anything. I've got to figure out a way to be open to it. There's also people who are searching who are in crisis, right? So that's the original. That's part of the original search, is those who are just bereft of meaning. So it's kind of like keeping all these balls in your mind. It sounds complicated, but essentially you're just trying to figure out, does this person care about meaning in life, or do they care about other things? Is this person want a dynamic, open-ended, lifelong choose your own adventure filled with uncertainty and weird possibilities? Or do they really want to nurture something that's already in their lives? And most people at least want to nurture some of the things that are already in their lives. But some people feel like, it's so changing all the time. I need to always be curious. And then, is this person in crisis? Does this person have a crisis of meaning? Like if I start asking, like, what makes your life meaningful? And they're like, I don't know. I've been trying to figure out for years. I'm really about to, right?
Yep, that's the rule.
Where to go with this. That's a scary search for meaning, because there's nothing holding it up. They're not growing. They're not adding to meaning in their lives. They know it's important, especially since people like me are running around talking about how important meaning of life is. And I mean, even huge sort of like Borg-like consultancy firms are offering purpose work to, pharmaceutical companies and everybody else, right? So it's on everybody's tongue, but we don't ever teach anybody how to actually do it. We just hope that they figure it out. So there are people who are pretty desperate, I think, at this point. And even people are doing well, I feel like are getting a little bit of FOMO around whether their life really has as much meaning as so-and-so else's life. So I think really like having those feelers out, and this goes best if you think through your own process. Like if you can think through, okay, what makes my life meaningful? And am I doing that? Right? Am I like, or am I just like, I definitely veg out in front of Netflix, or, I get far too much pleasure out of my one alcoholic beverage I'll have, like whatever that is, sometimes too, if it's a special occasion sort of thing, like I should, there's no reason I should get a lot of pleasure out of that, but I do, and I waste a lot of time doing dumb things and all that sort of stuff. Right. So knowing that, like reminding myself of that, like the target isn't like Dalai Lama proof purpose. The target is like regular human stuff where there's enough really, really solid things pushing forward that they feel like they're in it now. They feel like it's worth it. And then it can grow from there. So easy things that if you had a little bit more time or just want to give homework that you're not going to follow up on.
Well, let me tell you, we have the system is a bit funny, right? So I have my private practice, and it's my private practice is like it's a playground for me. I see my patients weekly, and I see them. We have some billing codes that allow you to see patients for say 30 minutes, which is 10 to 15 more than the usual medication tweak. And it turns out I'm a psychologist as well. And like my analyst, she's a Lacanian, and they have that. therapeutic time. I don't know how to translate to English, to be honest with you, but it's like they deliver a blow, drop the mic, and walk away. And so because in the argument is very good. So it's that you have that small window of time to fight the rest of the week, all the other hours of the week. So the impact that you cause should be the last thing in the session. So people really, take that blow and go about it. It's a decent argument, even though a lot of people think Lacan was a charlatan and just talking complex to get laid or something like that. I've heard all kinds of criticism towards it. But I see happening obviously. So I'm doing the same for a while now, and I just don't see myself stopping. So there are ways for prescribers to actually work that allow them to tap more into those things. Some insurance companies are a little bit more absurd with that. Like, for example, you take health management organizations that are operating Medicare or Medicaid, so the patients already have struggle with finances, and they are the ones with the higher copays. So yeah, that's going to limit you having 4 sessions a month, right? So come on, that's going to hurt your patient the more. But if you're a little bit flexible, it's better than what we do now. That's my feeling. I've been very optimistic about psychiatry because things are changing, and this movement is it's more than a seed right now. It's already more than a seed. The fact that we have to do things differently. But it's doable. It's doable. It's absolutely doable. We don't have to just say, well, nobody's going to pay for this. So, here's your Zoloft. Let's increase your Abilify. Let's, I saw this on TV, so it must be a good drug. I want to ask you to wrap up this conversation with a little bit about meaning and psychosis. As you mentioned, the schizophrenia, I ended up talking too much and I got distracted, which I do that all the time. Would you mind telling me about that a little bit?
Yeah. So it's complex, and it's certainly not resolved. There are a somewhat mixed pattern of results. I can think of maybe 3 or 4 studies where folks have managed to collect data from inpatient samples with on-the-books diagnoses of schizophrenia. I can't think of anything with like delusional disorder or brief psychotic disorder or schizoaffective. So I think like these are typically going to be.
The division is arbitrary. Don't worry about it. It's made up. A group of us sat down and decided how it's going to be. So it doesn't matter.
And interestingly enough, there's nothing on schizotypal or personality disorder either that I can find in the literature, although there's quite a bit on borderline now. So it's really variable. And I think the story that I like the best is one from one study from, I think, 1991 or 1990 by Roberts, and it's out of the UK. As I remembered, it's in a big stack of things I want to read. Again, so I'm writing a book, so I'll be revisiting this shortly. But in this study, there's 4 samples, right? So sample number 1, college students. Like everybody's got them, everybody samples them, right? Sample number 2, I believe in this sample, it was Anglican nuns. So nuns in the British Anglican, or what we think of as Episcopalian in the United States tradition. Samples 3 and 4 were both folks with schizophrenia diagnoses in their files. I think back in the 90s, they would just been called schizophrenics, right? So, so there's schizophrenia diagnoses. So the difference between sample 3 and 4 then is pre-treatment, in treatment. So, and then I'm going to give a pause, right? So what the research then was like essentially seeing who had the highest scores on this thing called the Purpose in Life test. This is not ideal for use in clinical samples because it has an item with regard to suicide. I've thought about it, for example. So there's some distress items in there that it's been heavily criticized for not being just about meaning. It's about other things. But that's what they used. And so you can rank these samples, right? Like, who do you think's got the highest? It could be the nuns, it could be the college students, it could be the schizophrenics who were treated, it could be the schizophrenics who were not treated. Who's the lowest? Like, what's the relative order? Because they ended up being in different orders. The scores were different across all those samples. So I'm kind of like tap dancing a little bit to give your readers a little chance to sort of commit on what they think.
Can you tell me the name of the purpose scale again?
Purpose in Life Test.
Purpose in Life Test.
Yeah, it was inspired by Frankl. It was published in the 1964, and so it didn't have access to sort of modern test theory and statistical methods. So it's a cool scale, but it's hard to it's a little tricky, right? So like if you take my scale, the Meaning in Life Questionnaire, everything is rated from like totally disagree to totally agree, right? And so the ones and the sevens mean the same thing on every single item. With the Purpose in Life test, every question has different anchors. So I like the suicide, I might be like, I think about it hardly at all to multiple times a day. There's another one, I feel with regard to, what's another one? With regard to looking at what I've got to do in my life, I feel discontented too. I have many great things I'd like to do. And it's like, well, is that a continuum everyone shares? So it's fascinating. And it was based closely on Frankl's work. So, but by modern standards, it's a bit of a disaster. So people have tried to clean it up. There's brief versions of it that do much better from the psychometric standpoint. But for better or for worse, most people use the more recent scales. So okay, so now everyone's had a chance to think about it. It's kind of a whole melange of everything. When you think of Viktor Frankl and purpose in life, is kind of on that scale. So everything from I've got things to do to I feel good about my life to I don't want to kill myself. All these sorts of things. So you ready for the ranking? We'll start from highest.
So we have college students, nuns, patients diagnosed with schizophrenia that are inpatient.
Inpatient, yes, in the 90s. Well, in the late 80s is when the data are collected.
All right, slightly different. And what was the fourth group?
Diagnosed but not yet treated with schizophrenia.
Diagnosed but not treated. Okay, please give us the ranking.
Okay, so starting at do you want to start at the top or the bottom?
The bottom. The
bottom. The lowest scores were among the folks diagnosed with schizophrenia in treatment.
I'm not surprised. All right.
Next, college students. Then a tie.
You're kidding me.
Nuns and people with schizophrenia who had not yet received treatment.
You know what?
So let me remind us of the three. This is my way of understanding it, and this is also what Roberts writes about. And this is what I think is so interesting, right? So, let's remember the coherence dimension of the three dimensions, right? The ability to make sense of what's happening to you. And these are people with, I think, generally probably a pretty good blend of, primarily probably positive symptoms, right? So like probably a lot of delusions, hallucinations, probably a lot of emotional lability and all those sorts of things. But we just focus, and this is where Roberts directed our attention to, was what, like, in a sense, when you have hallucinations, when you have paranoia, when you have all these aberrant things that mean that you're going through life with a different experience than other people, and an experience that you have a hard time sharing or convincing other people is real, which in a sense might lead to a diagnosis of schizophrenia. One skill you might argue that is developed to a pretty strong degree is that meaning-making skill. Like, I've come up with a reason why I feel like someone's looking at me. I've come up with a reason why my skin feels like it's got itchy crawling feelings, right? Like, and when people say like those things aren't real to you, those things aren't real, but you keep experiencing them, the argument goes that you're kind of left to your own devices to understand what's happening. And if you do that And a lot of people with schizophrenia seem to be able to build, in some cases, delusions, in other cases, conspiracies that other people share, or some belief system that helps them make sense of something that is kind of inherently very difficult to make sense of. So that was the argument there, which I think is really fascinating. And so then what you end up seeing is in later research from the 2000s and the 2010s, sometimes people with schizophrenia will score higher on meaning in life than other patients or even normal controls, and sometimes lower. And it's just not clear, because one of the things that from my understanding, I teach psychopathology, but I teach it in a doctoral counseling program, not a medical school. So when I take a look at what seems to be the most effective, the highest impacts on symptoms, it seems like medication is better at managing positive symptoms than negative symptoms. So it might reduce hallucinations, it might reduce the drift for delusions, but it's not building up social skills. It's not necessarily.
No, and you know what? It makes... So I had a few interviewees that were involved in the open dialogue. That is this sort of a family therapy or need adapted treatment way of addressing psychosis that was developed in Finland and is slowly catching up in different places. Of course, it's difficult to adapt this from a cost perspective. Not that it's more expensive than what we do here. Is by far nothing is more expensive than what we do here, but the money doesn't go to the right people when you do that. So if you were to change, and that of course it's a barrier. People always say, "Oh, how about the sustainability of that model in America? So for as long as we have to make the same people rich, no, right?" And I asked a lot of them the same question. I say, "Why do you think?" Because they make claims that are not easily testable by our standard, let's say, pharmaceutical-driven world, right? So, for example, double-blind randomized trials, they favor drugs. They favor drugs over anything else. It's easy to have a randomized double-blind, even though it's impossible, but it's easier to make it look like they have a double-blind trial. For antipsychotics, for example, we got to always keep in mind that the absolute majority of the trials that show that antipsychotics are a good idea, they're a good idea to keep you out of the hospital. Mm-hmm. They're a good idea to reduce positive symptoms, right? Now, everyone that I asked about this thing said, because I say, well, what is that they're doing? Are they giving meaning to the experience? Are they going there and validating? Because that's what they do. They go to the family, talk to the family and the patient at the same time when there's a family involved. So what do you think is happening? And they just talk about it, and the patient talks about it, and the family talks about it. And they don't have this sort of a correctional attitude that we have in this side of the world, where we say, no, that's a symptom, take this drug, let's suppress it, right? It's a different approach. So they have this claim that they managed to avoid chronic use of antipsychotics in about 80% of the patients. Now, there's a randomized going on. How double blind can it be? To answer, to sort of try to meet the standards that we have now, but it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, there was a paper recently where a bunch of world experts on schizophrenia were called to write about people have been questioning the use of antipsychotics, because in the short term, because the argument is antipsychotics, they don't suppress psychosis, they suppress all brain activities, from processing speed, memory, creativity to movement. This is literally everything the brain does, antipsychotics will suppress. And so it's like, okay, stay quiet in your corner. While people that went through the Soteria House or the open dialogue, they'll claim, no, you're giving yourself time to go through these things and experiencing them as much as possible. Gets to a limit at times. And, there are other meds that can be used. They're not antipsychotics. For some people, they just can't. They give their best, which goes in favor of saying it's unlikely that this one treatment is good for everyone going through that, which is just a logical statement that my field struggles to accept. To say, you don't have to give an antipsychotic to everyone hearing a voice. Chill, right? It makes no sense that this one treatment is going to serve everybody, especially with a diagnosis that has the interrated reliability that schizophrenia has that is below acceptable, right? You show the same patient to 10 doctors, they are going to come up with 10 different diagnoses. It's, really? We're going to drug this guy with a life-shortening drug?
Hey, it does
So
better with those interrated reliabilities than depression or generalized anxiety. So
it's still better, yeah, but it's oof, oof.
yeah,
So that actually, it's very interesting, this thing you're telling me, man. Because when I said, what are they doing? And the one of the answers, two of the times I got that answers, I think they're just giving meaning to it, to the experience, and letting it sit, as opposed to,
yeah.
invalidating and kind of trying to move on. That is
Yeah.
very interesting.
Well, I think it's it's one study,
Of
and
course, of
it
course.
is cross-sectional, and it's from England, for better or for worse. But the lesson I take away from it doesn't have to be prescriptive, and it doesn't have to push us towards an attitude about treatments. I mean, certainly those are treatments in the 80s and 90s, right? Early 90s, and it was. I don't know if it may have been a nadir. I'm not sure if they had any atypical antipsychotic medications in wide use at that time, or if it was still the old school stuff. And
Yeah, they're not superior, though. The thing is, there's also, I want to mention, there's a study by the World Health Organization, which I usually, because they're so heavily politicized, I usually, I'm very careful with what they publish, but they have this big study showing that developing countries had better overall recovery rates from schizophrenia than developed countries. And the only variable they could find to justify was less access to drugs. It makes you think, at least, right? You have to leave this question open, because we don't seem to have an answer.
yeah, well, I think that's part of the takeaways from a study like that. So part of the takeaways from a study like that is that, well, one, people people find meaning under all kinds of circumstances, and that doesn't automatically mean everything gets better, right? So that's one kind of takeaway. I mean, it's probably better than if we look at the folks who have been treated and who weren't treated, and the vast amount of literature. Like, having meaning is better than not having it. And people can generate meaning from all sorts of experiences, even ones that we would sort of all gather together and say that's not real. So that's interesting. I think, like, that's maybe a powerful message to take away. Like, even under pretty serious circumstances, people will be able to create meaning. So it's certainly possible in your office. It's certainly possible in my classroom. It's certainly possible in readers' offices, and it's probably already happening, right? Because I think it's a human urge to figure things out enough to whatever your enough level is. My enough level is high. I like thinking about the Neo-Babylonians. So I'll think about anything. Just, other people are like, just get me to whatever level it is, and then I'm good to go. I think the second interesting lesson starts with, like, what are we replacing, or what's there still when we take away symptoms, right? We're like, let's say it's 100% effective with no side effects. The next medicine that comes out, the next prescription, no side effects, works for everybody. All the positive symptoms are gone, and they can still move at an almost normal level. Right? It's not just like to suppress everything. What is left? Like, that's the thing I think haunts me a little bit about some of these studies. Like, what's left? And when people are, and I want to broaden this outside of the folks who've been treated with schizophrenia versus those who weren't treated for schizophrenia. Let's say that the treatment in this story I'm telling, the treatment took away the things that were being used to make meaning about life, right? Among someone who's got psychosis. But let's also imagine that one of the things that the treatment is taking away is and one of the things that the ability to treat people has taken away is that person's place among other folks, right? So you talk about one thing that happens in treatment with developing countries probably is that there isn't quite as much treatment for people with schizophrenia in developing countries. There's not as much treatment for people with depression in developing countries. There's not as much treatment for a lot of psychological illnesses, if they are even appropriate for that culture in the way that we describe them. So I think back, how are we treating schizophrenia 400 years ago? Well, just trying to keep someone in our family safe, right? And make sure everyone knew their quirks, and even the fact that they could be really dangerous. And I'm not sure that everyone, like the people with schizophrenia, they're more likely to be victims of violence than commit violence in
Yes.
the United States and around the world. So if what our approach to treatment ends at let's get rid of these symptoms, at least that person still has the question of what comes after that. Like, do I have a place among people? Do I have a way of finding meaning? Do I have a way of understanding my experience? And I think, like, whether someone has schizophrenia or not, those are questions we all struggle with. And when we find something that answers them, uh, especially if we learn the way that we can use to answer them again in the future if we need to, I really just feel like that's a powerful that's a powerful takeaway that I pull from that type of research, at least.
Very cool. Very cool. Wow. I really like this. Thank you. Michael, again, man, thanks a lot for your patience. I hunted this man down. Oh my God.
No, I'm a very disorganized person, so I was like constantly missing emails, and I'm not
Well,
able to find time.
well, met your match. Listen, again, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure having you here.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Rod.
Man, that was cool.
Great. Can I just say, like, I'm at Colorado State University, not University of Colorado.
Shit.
So for your intro.
I'll try to add it. I don't know how to add it. I'm probably going to put something written there as a joke.
Just put like a bleep.
Yeah, I'll do it.
I don't.
And what did I say?
University of Colorado.
Oh shit! I'm an
That's
asshole.
what Deion Sanders is.
I have in front of me, man. I copied pasted, and I was supposed to be reading, and I could. I'm so stupid.
I don't mind, but I'm sure it'd be a little bit in the sake of accuracy, I guess I should say.
I will. So I said, you know what? I'm going to start giving a positive spin to this thing because not only I lost all my friends, I don't think I'm causing the impact that I would like to cause, that is to revisit. So I thought of Hayes. I said, let's talk. This is what you could be doing as opposed to say, stop doing that, right? Yeah. Not gonna last. But
let me see if I can give you a little bit of encouragement that's not going to sound encouraging at all. When I think about the gold standard for purpose, again, bigger than anything I can try to do in my life, it's Nelson Mandela. I don't know how into the anti-apartheid movement you felt like you were or how much you've read, but at one point, so Mandela was kind of called late to be a political leader. He was the chief's son in a really important nation and lived a life of privilege within the bounds that were allowed to Black South Africans at the time, and was persuaded because he was a leader to take a stand. And very, very quickly he was imprisoned because he was an influential person. So he's in prison in Robben Island, right? And he was there for 24 years. And the only person he had to interact with initially was one racist, pro-apartheid white prison guard. He's literally on an island surrounded by great white sharks, like South Africa's Alcatraz, right? Although much scarier. And so I'll ask folks, like, do you think he failed his purpose of setting his people free? And the point I try to get at here is that if we can get in the right mindset, we're probably adopting purposes that can't actually be attained like a goal can be attained. Like, they're not really check-offable. Like, how do you know when you're a good parent? Like, when you're no longer a parent, right? But because you're dead or something else, right? So how do you know that your people are free? You could argue they're not free today, and Nelson Mandela's life is over, right? So it's this idea that it's the striving for it that is the indicator of whether it's a good purpose for you, not whether you get it done. And so Mandela has talked about this idea of impossibility. It's like nothing's impossible until you stop trying, right? This idea that
Very encouraging.
we're all pushing for something, and the outcome is the one thing that's not in our control. But if it's something that we're meant to be doing, then even the striving for it is part of our living out our life's meaning. So that's kind of like, it's a
I'm not
very
pay-
open-ended
I'm
deal.
I'm not paying for the session.